When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the palace could still control her papers. The coffin was different. In accounts of the burial instructions carried out by her doctor, Sir James Reed, Victoria asked for intensely private objects to be placed with her body. A photograph of John Brown, a lock of Brown's hair, and a ring connected to Brown's family. These objects were hidden from the royal children gathered around her deathbed. John Brown was no prince or minister. He was a Scottish servant from Balmoral. By the end of Victoria's life, his memory was close enough to be sealed beside her. The paper trail was more vulnerable. Within days, her son, the new King Edward VII, is reported by historians to have ordered Brown-related letters destroyed. Her daughter Princess Beatrice later spent decades transcribing, editing, and rewriting Victoria's private journals before many originals were destroyed. A ring in a coffin cannot prove a secret marriage. The sharper question is why Brown-related records were treated as dangerous while Victoria had already placed some of the most intimate evidence beyond family control. The palace could burn paper, rewrite diaries, and manage official memory. It could not reach what was already in the coffin. Before this becomes palace gossip, the evidence has to be sorted into 3 piles: what survived, what it suggests, and what rumor later built around the gaps. The first pile is material that survived: burial instructions, edited journals, correspondence, court testimony, newspaper satire, and later accounts from people close enough to glimpse what the palace wanted hidden. The second is what those records suggest but cannot fully prove: that Victoria's attachment to John Brown became unusually intimate, dependent, and threatening to the people around her. The third is the famous part: the alleged secret marriage, whispers of a hidden ceremony, and even wilder later claims. Those claims matter because they show what people were willing to believe once the archive had been damaged, but they are not proof. This investigation will not end by declaring Victoria and Brown secretly married. The surviving evidence does not allow that. So we follow only the trail that can be tested. A widowed queen becomes emotionally unreachable to almost everyone except a Scottish servant. That servant's access disturbs the household, irritates politicians, and enters public mockery. Then the royal family reshapes the record so aggressively that the missing pages become part of the story. To understand why those pages mattered, we go back before the burning, before the coffin, before rumour hardened into legend. 1861, when Victoria lost Albert and the monarchy's private grief became a public problem. The public problem began in the most private room of the monarchy, the household itself. In December 1861, Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle. He was only 42. For Victoria, Albert had been her husband, closest advisor, organizer, emotional anchor, and the person who helped translate her private will into the machinery of monarchy. When Albert was gone, the system around Victoria lost the one person who could reliably reach her. Victoria went into mourning with a force that defined her reign. Black clothing, shut rooms, preserved belongings, a court arranged around absence. Albert's rooms were kept as if he might return, and grief hardened into routine. But a monarchy cannot disappear into mourning. A sovereign rules through more than laws and signatures. A sovereign is seen. Openings, audiences, ceremonies, processions, the balcony, the carriage, the visible body of the crown. These were part of how the institution proved it was alive. Victoria wanted retreat. She withdrew from London society, avoided many public appearances, and spent long stretches away from the capital. To her, retreat was survival. To critics, it looked like abandonment. This is where grief stopped being private. If the Queen is unreachable, anyone who can steady her gains value. Not through office or parliament, but because access inside a palace is power. Victoria's refuge pulled her north towards Scotland, toward Balmoral, the Highland estate she and Albert had loved. There, the court was smaller, the rituals more private, and the person who began to matter most was not a minister, heir, or prince. It was John Brown. At Balmoral, Brown came to the Queen through service, not rank. John Brown was a Scottish gillie, part of the Highland world around Victoria's private estate. Horses, rough tracks, wet heather, guns, ponies, outdoor routines. He was not polished for drawing rooms, trained to flatter her, or schooled in courtly hesitation. To a grieving queen exhausted by ceremony, that bluntness mattered. As Victoria's widowhood hardened, Brown moved through the practical rhythm of her days. Rides, journeys, attendance at Balmoral. The kind of repeated service that leaves no grand title behind, but changes who is present when decisions, moods, and routines take shape. Over time, he became a personal servant whose usefulness was emotional as well as physical. He could steady the day, enforce routine, and speak plainly where courtiers had to calculate every word. In a modern household, that might sound like loyalty. Inside a Victorian palace, it was a breach in the architecture of rank. The royal world was built in layers: queen, family, ministers, ladies-in-waiting, equerries, private secretaries, courtiers. Servants were essential but socially invisible. They opened doors, carried messages, prepared horses, managed fires, and disappeared. Brown did not disappear. He kept showing up in the places that mattered: near the carriage, on the Highland path, at the edge of the Queen's daily routine. Close enough to know her moods, and close enough for her to depend on him. That made him alarming. The record does not require us to imagine secret conversations. The observable problem was simpler. A servant stood unusually near the sovereign, and people born far above him had to work around that fact. The question followed him out of Balmoral. If John Brown could reach Victoria when others could not, how much influence did that closeness create? Once people inside the palace asked that question, they left traces of alarm. Not a confession, not a document that settles the relationship. Something more revealing in a palace. The ordinary paperwork of irritation. Surviving letters and later historical accounts tied to Victoria's private secretary, Sir Henry Ponsonby, treat Brown as a household problem that could not be neatly filed away. The source trail is careful but clear. Ponsonby-related correspondence, court resentment, and repeated concern over perceived influence. The concern was not simply that Brown was close to the Queen. It was that closeness seemed to give him license. He accompanied her constantly. He could be blunt where others were deferential. In accounts of the household and government around Victoria, he was treated as someone who might affect her daily choices, movements, moods, and access. That was combustible in a court built on rank and ritual. Victoria's children noticed. Courtiers noticed. Ministers, watching the Queen's public role from outside the household, noticed too. Brown's position was hard to name. He was not a minister, so he could not be challenged politically. He was not family, so he could not be managed as a prince or son. He was a servant whose access seemed to place him above people born far higher. The first evidence layer is not romance, it is alarm. People around Victoria believed Brown had influence. Then the whispers escaped the house. By the late 1860s and 1870s, Brown was no longer only a Balmoral irritation. Satirical papers and cartoons treated him as a symbol of royal disorder, the rough Highland attendant somehow at the centre of the Queen's private world. The cruel nickname attached to Victoria was Mrs. Brown. That phrase matters. The scandal was not invented by modern biographers. People at the time saw something unusual and mocked it through class, gender, marriage, and humiliation. Satire cannot prove a secret ceremony, a sexual relationship, or a hidden life. It can show public suspicion. By this point, Brown's closeness to Victoria was visible enough that Britain could laugh at it. For a monarchy already struggling with an absent queen, that laughter was not harmless. For the Crown, the laughter landed at the worst possible point, between a queen retreating from public performance and a country asking what monarchy was for. Victoria had not stopped being sovereign. Ministers still came to her, papers still moved, government did not suddenly belong to John Brown. But monarchy is not only paperwork, it is visibility, ceremony, confidence, the repeated public proof that the person at the centre is still present. Victoria's long retreat after Albert's death made that proof harder to stage. Openings, appearances, and court rituals carried political weight. When she avoided them, critics could turn grief into an argument against royal privilege. Republican feeling in Britain never became a simple tidal wave, but in the 1860s and 1870s it was real enough to worry defenders of the crown. That is why the gossip had institutional weight. If a Scottish servant appeared to have easier access to the Queen than courtiers, ministers, or her own children, access itself became a political fact. The question was not whether Brown secretly issued orders. It was whether the royal household looked as if it had lost control of its own centre. Inside the family, that was humiliating. Victoria's children had grown up under Albert's idealized memory. Now they watched a blunt Highland attendant occupy a space of daily trust they could not easily enter. For the Prince of Wales, Bertie, the future Edward VII, the problem was also inheritance. He would one day receive not only a throne, but an image, the dignity, distance, and moral authority of the crown. Brown threatened that image because he made monarchy look intimate, dependent, and breachable. When Bertie became king, he had reason to ask what traces of that breach remained in the archive. When Bertie became Edward VII in 1901, he inherited more than Victoria's crown. He inherited the papers that could shape how her reign would be remembered. By then, John Brown had been dead for 18 years. He died in 1883, and Victoria did not simply move on. She kept his memory close and left signs that his place in her life had not faded into ordinary service. Brown was no longer a living man who could be managed. He was a problem preserved in paper, memory, and objects. Then the record was attacked. Biographers and royal historians report that Edward VII destroyed Brown-related correspondence and memorabilia after Victoria's death. The exact contents are not recoverable. Burned letters cannot be read backward. Ash is not a confession. The reported act matters because it shows that material connected to Brown was treated as risky to Victoria's official memory. The slower erasure came through the journals. Victoria had kept journals across her life, an enormous private record of a monarch who wrote constantly. After her death, Princess Beatrice spent decades transcribing those journals into edited copies. She omitted, softened, and reshaped material she considered unsuitable. When each volume was copied, the original was destroyed. So what survives is not simply Victoria's voice, it is Victoria's voice after a royal copying project. Selection, omission, transcription, and the loss of originals. That is the escalation. The archive did not only lose evidence, it produced an edited witness. Missing pages do not permit invention. They do not tell us what the destroyed letters said. What they prove is curation. The royal family treated parts of Victoria's private record as dangerous enough to remove from history. Once that happened, absence became evidence. Not of what Brown and Victoria did behind closed doors, but of how much risk the palace saw in leaving the record whole. The archive drawer closes and the empty space becomes the clue. The edited archive points back to motive. Brown was dangerous to the crown because his closeness made the royal image harder to control. Victorian monarchy depended on distance, ceremony, family virtue, and social hierarchy. Brown cut across that image. He was a Highland servant, not a prince, minister, or aristocratic advisor. Yet he could enter rooms others could not, speak with a bluntness others avoided, and reach the Queen when her own family and government struggled to move her. Class order was the first fracture. In a court built on rank, every doorway carried meaning. A servant appearing closer to Victoria than her children or senior officials made the hierarchy look less natural than it was supposed to look. Moral symbolism came next. Victoria had become the widow in black, the public emblem of devotion to Albert. Any suggestion that another man occupied an intimate place in her emotional life complicated the image the monarchy had spent decades presenting. Inside the family, the problem was practical as well as embarrassing. A palace is doors, letters, schedules, habits, and who gets admitted when the sovereign is tired or grieving. Brown's presence exposed how political that household space could be. For Edward VII, protecting Victoria's reputation also helped protect the monarchy he inherited. The record shows later control of papers and journals. The interpretation is that some in the family had reason to narrow what history could see. That control did not settle the rumors. It kept the trail broken. The responsible scale stays firm. Closeness, influence, burial wishes, and archival curation are evidence. Secret marriage remains unproven. The missing record changed the story anyway. It turned uncertainty into an inheritance. Now the investigation returns to the one place the palace could no longer edit, the objects Victoria took into the coffin. The final answer is not the one rumor wants. What survives does not let us say Victoria and John Brown were secretly married. It does not prove a hidden child. Those claims remain outside the responsible evidence, but the documents do leave a harder truth. Victoria relied on Brown with an intensity that disturbed her family, household, and parts of the political world around her. She gave him access that breached the normal hierarchy of a royal court. She honored him after death in private, physical ways. Photographs, hair, keepsakes, and burial instructions meant to stay beyond the reach of her children. After Victoria died, the royal family curated the record. Letters were burned, journals were copied, edited, and originals destroyed. The archive we have is not a neutral accident of survival, it is a shaped inheritance. That is the irony at the center of this story. If the palace had left the record alone, John Brown might have remained an intimate, uncomfortable chapter in Victoria's life. Instead, the gaps became part of the evidence. The silence acquired a shape. The crown tried to protect itself by controlling what history could see, but monarchy is made not only of crowns, portraits, processions, and gold. It is also made of paper, locked drawers, what survives in a coffin, and what someone chose to burn.